Hey guys, sorry about the long lull in content. Even at the speakeasy, sometimes life can throw wild curveballs, new puppies get adopted, and schedules fill up real quick. For this upload, I wanted to try something a little different, a little more real and personal. While my countdowns and documentaries are entertaining in their own right, recently I've felt the need to stretch my creativity a bit, so here goes. Today, after running errands with Barry, I was heading home in a daze that I'm sure more than a few of you who have to commute are familiar with, when I found myself on the back roads between local towns on a route that I don't normally take. It was a calm evening, so I figured what the heck, I'll turn up the tunes, roll down the windows, and let my mind wander a bit. And as it wandered, that aforementioned yearning for creativity started to take hold. The twisted tree limbs framed in the skies above became outstretched arms. Every dead-end sign foretold of an imminent demise, and I spied several large creatures amidst the brush that I'm sure were just deer, right? While my logical half kept me focused, a primal part of me couldn't help but wonder, is there something off? Is there something out there? Thank you everyone for riding with me through this handful of my very own original nightmares. Buckle up. Here are 5 scary late night drive stories. Number 1, the Moonlight Crier. As I loaded up my car, I glanced over at the setting sun. I wasn't normally off work this late and was dreading having to battle what seemed to be a perpetual Friday night traffic rush, consisting of both angry locals and tourists wanting to visit our little slice of paradise. Wasting no time, I threw my jacket and the rest of my belongings into the back of my rig before backing out of my parking space and heading for home. As expected, traffic on the highway was moving at the sluggish pace of anywhere from 2 to 5 miles per hour. And after a while, I started to get impatient, but then I saw it. A road sign nearly hidden behind overgrown leaves of an adjacent tree that I happened to know led through the forest, past an old park, and in a roundabout right to where I needed to get to. Normally, it would have been smarter to stay on the highway, but in this very rare instance, this roundabout path would likely actually prove faster. Without a second thought, I flicked on my blinker and ripped down the visibly abandoned stretch. As the lights from the main drag faded in my mirror, I turned on my brights in order to watch for eyes in the thickening forests. And something about the surrounding darkness around my car reminded me of a submarine enveloped by the deep black of the ocean, a thought which sent instant chills down my spine. I turned the radio up louder and let my hand out the window to surf on the passing air, when something broke my train of thought. Just as I was nearing the edge of the park, which was held deep within the woodlands, I thought I could barely make out the sound of a scream or a cry emanating from within. I slowed to a crawl as I neared the only streetlight on the entire stretch, which marked the turn for the park's lot, which was currently completely void of vehicles. I turned off my radio and listened for moments. The wind threw branches and leaves from side to side. A creek bubbled in the distance somewhere, and otherwise, the night was pretty quiet. But just as I was about to accelerate, I heard it again, a little louder this time. Whatever it was, this noise sounded human and in distress. I whipped into the parking lot and claimed the space furthest back toward the park itself, retrieved a flashlight from my glove compartment, and began walking along the main trail. If someone was in trouble at this time of night and this far out in the woods, time was of the essence. Now normally, if you're trying to find someone who's lost in the forest, the first thing you want to do is make sound and call out for them. But for some reason, every time I went to yell, my voice would get caught in my throat. Something didn't feel right. I wondered how this person had gotten out there in the first place. Had they hiked in from town? Hitchhiked? Were they left behind from some party? And why hadn't they used a phone to call for help? As I considered what variables had presented themselves thus far, without noticing, I accidentally deviated from the main trail and found myself in a thicket of wispy aspens that extended far past my flashlight's capabilities. I spun the beam in a 360, studying the area for any sign of human life, but perceived nothing amiss. I had just turned back in the direction of my car, which was well out of sight by then, and was attempting to navigate a particularly thick patch of brush, when suddenly, the sound I'd been seeking erupted about 50 yards to the right. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Almost as if by instinct, I began moving in the direction of the shrill commotion, but something caused me to pause, and immediately shut off my flashlight. Why would a baby be this far out this late? Unless it was abandoned there literally minutes before I'd arrived, realistically, it wouldn't have survived for any sizable amount of time. And who would abandon their baby in a park frequented by other people, right off of a trail? The crying started back up again, but I noticed something. It was almost like a recording, like a nearly identical repetition of the last cry I'd heard. My stomach started rolling, and I was overcome by the natural instinct that I should quiet my footsteps and just get back to my rig. I squinted through the darkness at the ground, trying to make out patches of grass and dirt that I could step on to muffle my gait. One foot after the other, I inched away from the spine-tingling cries and closer to my car, which I knew was just barely out of view through the trees. I'd made it around 20 feet or so when the worst thing that could possibly have happened transpired. As I brought my right foot down, I felt it hover oddly above the ground with this weird resistance, before crunching down on whatever stick or hunk of bark had caught me up, which resulted in a deafening crack. I held my breath in anticipation. I heard the odd baby crying sound cease instantly, and through the darkness, I had the distinct and perturbing feeling that whatever was out there was staring directly at me. I began picking up the pace. However, after causing significantly more noise than before, I abandoned my stealth tactics entirely and broke into a full panicked sprint. As I pushed my legs to the limit, I heard the baby crying noise start back up, but instead of remaining at ground level, they swiftly lifted up about 15 feet in height into the air and warped into guttural growling instead. I then heard aspens cracking as my unseen pursuer cut through the thicket at a surprising speed and directly towards my escape route. As this thing gained on me, it became clear that I was physically outmatched. But just as I'd started to lose hope, a stroke of luck manifested in the form of me tripping into a dried creek bed, rolling around 16 yards down the side of a hill, and coming to rest just under a hollowed-out log. I held perfectly still, watching the ridgeline under the moonlight, and that's when I saw it. Whatever it was crawled slowly into view at the top of the ridge. It appeared hominid, however, after comparing it to surrounding trees, I deduced it was probably just over 10 feet in height. From what I could see, this creature toted eerily exaggerated features, such as a huge nose, which it was currently using to sniff the air for any signs of my scent. Frozen in fear, I'm not sure how many minutes passed as I observed the crier scout the entirety of the ridgeline before disappearing out of sight, and even then, I continued to wait for just a bit longer, until I found the courage to slowly pull myself to my feet. Not knowing exactly where this beast was, I resumed my tiptoeing in the direction I knew the parking lot to be, and after what felt like an eternity, as soon as my feet touched asphalt, I sprinted the last 20 yards to my car, all the while wholly believing the crier was going to swoop me up at the last minute. But to my eternal joy, I made it without incident. I threw myself inside, twisted the ignition, and accelerated out of the lot onto the main byway to about 80 miles per hour, a speed which I dangerously maintained even around the old road's many twists and turns until I was finally back to the safety of the city. I'm still not sure what I ran into that night, but ever since, I've had no issues weathering the local traffic. Number 2, the bridge. With the advent of social media and the rapid spreading of information's previously exclusive haunted locations have pretty much all become dark tourism destinations. And with the masses, when myself and my friends Jane and Trevor heard there was a particularly haunted crossing all of an hour's drive from our hometown, we wasted no time planning our own little ghost hunting trip. When the night arrived, we packed our equipment and supplies, loaded up my SUV, and shot off through the forest in search of what was known as the Banshees Bridge. According to legend, this particular bridge acted as home to a vengeful spirit that was responsible for a number of drownings, and in an eerie coincidence, a range of inexplicable drownings had occurred near. The drive out to Banshees Bridge was made all the more ominous by the sea of looming pine trees that encroached upon us. In place of listening to music, our party opted for radio silence, during which time we discussed paranormal phenomena and other stories and locations that would be fun to check out in the future. The bridge was a ways off the main road, and as we closed in on our destination, we ended up on a dirt path that twisted and turned wildly, to the point where we lost all sense of direction. After some time had passed, and just as we were starting to conclude that we might be a bit lost, our headlights washed over stone rubble about 50 yards out. As we neared this rubble, we found ourselves on the edge of a nearly ancient-looking crossing that could only be the Banshees Bridge. While the bridge itself wasn't large by any means, its foundation shot down a good ways into the creek below, and the arches created by the whole of the construct were ultimately fairly impressive. We parked hastily off to the side of the bridge and on foot began to explore the area. First, and in line with some variations to the legend, we attempted to stand in the middle of the bridge and call out to the Banshee to no avail, and later, in line with an alternate version, we attempted walking its length back and forth a number of times, but nothing out of the norm presented itself. We stood in the middle of the bridge and bided our time, and after a while sat down and began chatting amongst ourselves, at which point we decided we'd stay until around 3 in the morning, or more appropriately, until the devil's hour, or witching hour. Telling stories and laughing together, 3 o'clock was upon us before we knew it, and right at the cusp, we all lingered in anticipation. While my logical brain told me the hour would pass and that the area would be just as quiet and calm as it was before 3, I would be lying if I didn't admit that my heart harbored some primal fear that perhaps the world itself would implode right as the hour hand struck, or that the banshee would descend upon us, pulling us all into the currents below. 3 o'clock, yelled Jane. We all waited in silence, but just as I had started to relax, we all detected a sound at the far end of the crossing. It seemed to be, was that bootsteps? Cutting straight for us through the dark? Oh my god, yelled Trevor. It's the banshee! Frozen in terror, all we could do was stare into the pitch black as whatever encroached did so at a rate that would make anything other than bailing straight off of the sides of the bridge completely pointless. There was no outrunning whatever this was. We had to face our fear head on. As I began preparing myself for the swift death that so many others had experienced before, the shadow was broken by an easily recognizable form that instantly put all of us at ease, even before our brains understood what was happening. It was just a small wild pig, and upon sighting us, in a panic, it bolted straight around our group, and as soon as it had cleared the end of the bridge, cut a sharp left down towards the cover of the brush near the creek. We all looked around at each other in disbelief, hands still raised defensively. It's the freaking banshee, chided Jane toward Trevor, punching him in the arm. You nearly gave me a heart attack, man. We all laughed together and decided that we were fine hanging through the rest of the hour just to see if anything actually supernatural did transpire. It was getting late, and we all made ourselves comfortable around the edges of the bridge, and at this point I think we all kind of started to doze off a bit. As soon as my eyes were closed, in a half-sleep state, I began dreaming. But not normal dreaming, rather the type of shallow dreaming one does just before a falling dream wakes them minutes later, ripping them from slumber long before REM. In these deluded visions, I beheld the banshee of the bridge in all of her terror, her skin cracked and white, her eyes rolling back into her head, and an almost black and white look overtook her as she glid unnaturally through the air, her hair flowing in unpredictable directions, her mouth opened wide in a silent scream. I ran as fast as I could, but in typical night terror fashion, my legs felt as if they were knee-deep in quicksand. The banshee began pulling stones from her bridge, then throwing them dangerously directly at me, and it was all I could manage to bend and twist to avoid being hit. As I barely dodged her assault, I heard the stones sailing into the creek below. Plop, thud, plop, plop, thud, plop. It was at this time that my mind began to awaken. Much in the same way as when our dreaming minds turn the sound of a very real thunder into something entirely different in said dream state, such as, say, the crash of a car or a thud on a door that doesn't exist, the sound of what my mind was telling me were rocks dropping into the waters beneath the bridge, which as it happened were very real sounds, were what pulled me to. I glanced around the bridge to find the repeated plopping was also waking Jane and Trevor. Cautiously, we approached the edge of the construct and looked down under the full moon, and to our horror, observed something far more sinister than any banshee. At the edge of the creek stood a threatening and thick silhouette that appeared almost hominid, but was crouched as a gorilla would be, though it seemed to have either no hair or such short hair that it was nearly undetectable. After focusing for several seconds, we saw what was producing the splashing noises. Whatever this brutish thing was, it had captured the pig we'd seen earlier, which it appeared was still barely alive, and was in the process of thrashing it violently into various rocks as well as holding its head under the water for short periods of time. Just then, Trevor let out a gasp of horror, and the beast froze. It turned and stared directly up at our party with nearly glowing red eyes and a nasty scowl, before rapidly hobbling at a threatening pace under the bridge, all the while emitting threatening grunts and deranged howls. Wasting no time, we all turned on heel and sprinted back to my SUV, jumped in and gunned it all the way back to town, where we called the local authorities, and despite sounding like we were either crazy or on something, told them every last detail. Following a series of sobriety checks, a unit was dispatched to the old bridge, and just for closure, we asked if we could follow along, a permission we were granted probably on the premise that the authorities likely didn't believe we'd actually seen anything. Disturbingly, through their search, nothing was ever uncovered, and to this day, it weighs heavily on my mind that whatever that thing was could have just moved on to another bridge somewhere else, and could still be waiting for its next human victims. Number 3. Outhouse. In my hometown, from sophomore year and onward, bonfires are a big part of our culture. Our city is encompassed by a range of nature expanses, trails, campsites, and more, and lacking the nightlife of other larger metros, youth have always been pulled back out to said nature, even if it's just to enjoy a few beers and stories amongst good friends. But during my senior year, one particular bonfire changed everything. The night had started out like normal. Before sundown, we'd all met at a local grocery store parking lot to make sure we were all stocked up with wood and other supplies, following which, we waited on a text from the hosts with directions to their selected site. That night, the site that was chosen was called Twister, due to the fact that from a topographical view, roads leading out to it paralleled and swirled in a manner not dissimilar to a cyclone, up to the top of a particularly significant high desert peak. Once at Twister, the party commenced, and while I'll spare most of the details, the event could easily be described in whole as your typical high school get-together, filled with plenty of shenanigans, laughs, bad guitar solos, dating drama, and pretty much everything else you'd imagine in such a situation. Eventually, the fire died down, and groups began making their way back to their designated vehicles, before ripping off across the surrounding and rather familiar desert sands. Normally, my best friend Riley would stay behind until everyone was gone, chat for a few minutes alone, and then douse the fire. However, on this night, Riley was engaged elsewhere, leaving me the honors of closing out all on my own. And if I was being honest, standing out there in the middle of nowhere by myself was actually pretty creepy. I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me from just out of sight. When the fire was doused, I chugged what was left of my water, jumped in my truck, and tore off down the familiar dusty roads that led towards home. While the day had been a sunny one, the night told a different story. Heavy overcast blotted out the stars and moon, and aside from the assurance offered to me from what little was revealed in my headlights, I might as well have been swallowed whole by some massive denizen. Mid-drive and still on the dirt road, it hit me. The call of nature beckoned. I needed to use a restroom. Now, being so far out in the back 40, it would have been easy for me to just pull over and pick a spot, but on this night, I was already kind of spooked, and as weird as it sounds, the thought of relieving myself out in the pitch black without Riley yelling insults over my shoulder actually sounded pretty petrifying. So I decided to hold it for a few more minutes and altered my course toward an old ranger outpost that offered a proper and, most importantly, lighted outhouse. Upon reaching the station, I glanced around my truck to see if there was anything I wanted to take with me, and to my eternal regret, I actually passed up my phone because I figured I'd be right back. Hindsight is 20/20 though, and had I known what was about to transpire, different choices would probably have been made. I jogged my way to the outhouse, locked the door, and started attending to my business. But just as I'd began, something caught my eye. You know those little air grates at the top of outhouses? The ones that if you're over 5'10" or so you can see out of, and actually get a 360 view of your surroundings? Well, absent-mindedly, I stared through this outhouse's grates, and from them, I could see my truck lights pouring over bushes on the other side, and past that, nothing but darkness. But as I observed this scene, I noticed motion. Something moved from the far darkness and up to the bushes in a fraction of a second. I squinted and moved my head back and forth to see through the porous wall. Just over the brush was what appeared at first to be a deer, or maybe an antelope, but something was off. It was massive, and the way this deer moved, jerking and slinking from side to side. At first I thought it was injured, but I'd seen injured deer, and this one seemed to be displaying almost predatory behavior, like what you see when big cats stalk their prey. I finished my business quickly, keeping my eyes glued to this imposter the whole time. But just as I was considering staying put and observing this creature, I played witness to what I'd describe as the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. This thing sniffed the air twice, turned slowly towards the outhouse, and without warning, burst into a half-sprint, half-gallop right in my direction, alternating between 2 legs and 4. In the next split second that I can only describe as pure survival instinct, I considered what would happen if I stayed there, how I'd be stuck in this outhouse with that creature at the door, and with no other way out. And in that moment, I forced myself to open the door before sprinting straight towards my truck. As I rounded the truck, I heard the gallop of hooves right on my tail. I just managed to get seated and slam the door when I saw this strange abomination slide to a stop just outside of my window. Its soulless eyes locked with mine. It tilted its head to one side as if studying me. And then, just as I slammed on the gas and began to accelerate, it pounded what I swear appeared to be a human hand into the departing bed of my truck. When I was a mile or two away, I remembered my phone. I grabbed it from the console and called Riley, who told me to come directly to his place. Riley spent some time calming me down, and though I could tell he didn't really believe me, he promised we'd still go back out there to the same spot with guns and see if we couldn't find anything. The next day, we drove back out to the ranger outpost, and while there was no sign of my assailant from the previous night, disturbingly, eventually we did stumble across deer prints leading away from my tire tracks that, after a time, seemingly warped into hominid prints before disappearing entirely. Number 4. Wrong turn. I tapped my car's console display in attempts to refresh the GPS. Where in the world was this thing taking me? I'd lived in this area my whole life, and had never seen some of the roads I had since following this stupid nav computer. Thankfully, my crossover was all-wheel drive, as around 6 miles of said roads had already been fairly rough dirt and rock ones with unmanaged potholes that would have easily claimed a less observant motorist's tire. And the reason for my impromptu off-road adventure? Well, over the weekend, I'd attended my uncle's wedding, and thinking I could save a little time, I'd chosen the route with the least traffic and shortest ETA. I wouldn't be making that mistake again. Currently, I was on a fairly well-manicured gravel stint of the drive. Deciduous trees encroached on my car, and every stone and stump that I passed was overgrown in ferns and moss. The sun was just disappearing, and the sky's color coupled with the lush setting created a beautiful yet eerie ambiance. I'd just crested a hillside and was descending down into a tree hollow when I came to a fork in the road where something caught my attention. I glanced down at my car's screen. The GPS was telling me to turn right, but an arrow in front of me told me to go left, and another sign next to that read that the other route was closed to through traffic and was dangerous. I considered where my nav computer had gotten me so far, and decided to trust reality over technology. Flicking my left blinker on and turning to what seemed to be a more managed route, I shut my nav screen off. Honestly, it was just a distraction at this point. As I cruised down the road, it became very straight and fully paved, allowing me to open up a bit and accelerate to 80 miles per hour or so. I rolled down the window and breathed the fresh and humid forest air. This drive wasn't so bad. Interestingly enough, though, as I crested a high point overlooking a length of straight, something perturbed me. In the distance, I thought I detected a lake or maybe a mirage, but there were no lakes out this direction. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I sped closer and closer to this dark expanse, a feeling of unease took over my stomach, and I'm not sure what prompted me to do so, but I began braking slowly. But unease quickly turned to panic, and I was forced to slam on my brakes when I realized that the large dark mass in front of me wasn't a lake, it was a huge quarry, and that the road I was on led directly towards a roughly 90-foot drop. Luckily, pre-braking had slowed me to a mere 40 miles per hour, and I managed to skid to a halt only 15 feet or so from the edge of this massive cliff face. I breathed the fear away. I grabbed a flashlight from my dash and slowly made my way towards the edge of the hole. I couldn't believe it. There were other tire tracks leading right up to the drop, some that appeared as if they hadn't been so lucky. And when I shone the beam over, I could just make out the form of what seemed to be piled up wreckage far below. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to see what the damage was. I slowly made my way around the quarry until I found a proper path cut through the side that descended into its depths. I made my way probably 300 yards around it and back down to the spot below where the road ended. Sure enough, the broken remains of around 6 cars were all present. I gulped and glanced inside several, but to my complete surprise, there were no bodies or even bones anywhere in sight. Just as I was wondering what kind of predators in the area would remove a whole body from a vehicle, I noticed something else that caused my blood to freeze. Each of the cars had either a door or rear hatch opened, as if either those who crashed walked away afterwards, which was highly unlikely, or as if something capable of opening doors had fished their remains from within. Amidst a growing fear that probably originated from our prehistoric ancestors millennia back being literally hunted through the brush by larger beasts, in that moment, I felt strongly that I'd made a detrimental error. I immediately began backtracking along the quarry path, rushing as quickly and quietly as I could toward my car, all the while keeping my eyes peeled on the edges above for signs of anyone or anything that might be watching. Once back to my car, I jumped inside, skidded into a U-turn, and took off as quickly as possible in the direction from which I'd originally traveled. A short distance down the road, I started to calm myself down. Maybe these wrecks had already been reported, and maybe authorities or EMTs had removed bodies. Heck, maybe even a couple did miraculously survive. Maybe locals or someone sick had turned the sign the wrong direction to mess with tourists. By the time I'd reached that split that had sent me off on my deadly path again, I'd hatched a logical plan. I pulled over right at the fork, whipped out my multi-tool, and got ready to correct the arrow sign and turn it the right direction to possibly save the next motorist from making the same mistake. To my surprise, the sign was held on by a single screw, which was just taut enough to hold it in place, requiring me to simply twist the sign to the right instead. Easy. I even gave the single screw a little torque just in case the sign was flipping itself in the wind, before hopping back in my car and setting off on the correct path. But just as I'd put to bed any doubts of nefarious activity, and just as I'd started to depart the fork, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror. To my horror, in the fading illumination of my running lights, I watched as the unmistakable shape of an abnormally long, dark, and hominid hand reached effortlessly down around 7 feet from the nearby tree before twisting the sign back to the left. Number 5. Behind. How long of a commute would you be okay with? What pay point would change your opinion on that? Would you consider compensation for all that travel through special perks or benefits? These were all questions I was asked daily by my boss, who honestly really had gone the extra mile to keep me around. The thing about the small town I lived in was there wasn't really any real work, while the larger city my boss's company was located in, which might I add was a cool hour and 15 minutes from my house, was chock full of corporations, medical centers, restaurants, and pretty much any other career path one could dream of. But at the end of the day, a total of 2 hours and 30 minutes extra is a lot of lifetime spent. And recently, the drive had been making me tired. One night, through the summer, I decided to stay late for some overtime and didn't leave the office until long after dark. I began my commute home, which was surprisingly relaxing with less traffic, and threw on my favorite playlist to help stay awake. All of 5 miles out of the city, however, something strange happened. And I know a lot of people report things like this all of the time, but a distinct illumination, like an orb, came zipping up behind my speeding car with ease. For some reason, my heart began to race. I'd never been scared of the supernatural before. Heck, I'd even welcome an encounter. But there was something unnatural about how this light moved. This thing disappeared from my rearview mirror as it flew directly over my car just out of sight. And then I heard it, a knocking sound. Whatever it was sounded like it was trying to barge its way inside. Without thinking, I jerked my steering wheel one direction in attempts to throw off whatever it was. But doing so at the speed I was traveling at nearly resulted in me fishtailing into the guardrail. I jerked more carefully left than right, and saw whatever it was flit off behind me once more. As soon as this manifestation was off of my car, I pushed the gas pedal to the floor and accelerated as quickly as my older sedan would allow. But even at 80 or 90 miles per hour, whatever this ghastly glow was caught up with relative ease, and this time flitted right next to my window, as if watching me. Again, it started knocking into the side of my car. Terrified, I could barely see through tears, and in another attempt to throw off whatever this thing was, I swerved directly into it. Surprisingly, this maneuver had an effect, and the orb was thrown off into the trees. With a moment to breathe, I ripped out my phone and called 911. I told them everything, and while the operator seemed skeptical at first, they let me know there would be police waiting back at my house. Unable to focus on the road in such a panic, I asked to disconnect the call and continue on my drive. However, no sooner had I ended said call when, to my absolute horror, the orb descended from above me before floating, this time next to my passenger door. I swerved at it again, but this time it was ready and dodged my maneuver with ease. We kept at this strange game of cat and mouse for miles, me swerving and whatever this thing was flitting around my car, until, before I knew it, I was pulling up to my driveway, and to a scattering of police vehicles, at a speed that probably wasn't exactly safe. I skidded to a halt in my driveway, ripped open the door, and pointed straight at it. "It's right there," I yelled. "Does anyone else see it? It's right there." But my voice trailed off as I glanced around. Nearly 30 police officers were braced against the aforementioned vehicles, but their guns weren't pointed at the orb. They were pointed directly at my car. No sooner had I turned back towards my car when a hulking figure lunged directly at me from an open back door, and I'd barely had time to perceive what was about to transpire when all 30 police officers opened fire with brutal precision, shutting down my assailant mere feet from my person. "Run to us!" one officer yelled. "Run to us now!" In a daze, I sprinted towards the wall of officers who absorbed me like a shield, and watched as units moved up to the body of a man that looked to be about 6'5" and maybe 260 pounds of pure muscle. An officer made his way over to me. "That guy was in your back seat the whole ride. He's been responsible for a slew of similar killings, and that," he pointed up to the light in the sky I'd been so scared to look at before, "that isn't an orb. It's a couple of kids from the city with a long-ranged racing drone who happened to spot this man in your car. They called us shortly after you did, and realized the only way they could keep you safe was to cause you to swerve every time he started to move forward on you." Thanks for joining me for this first round of scary stories. For my literature aficionados out there, that last one was my own little twist on a very old and widespread urban legend. And for those of you who have heard some of its original formats, let me know if I surprised you there. If you enjoyed my diabolical diatribes, remember, like this upload, subscribe to the channel, and share them with anyone you feel could use a good scare. As always, I'll see you next time, and safe travels.